you could actually increase the local solar generation from an entire subdivision like 10 or 15% by sometimes just rotating the whole thing before you do anything, right? Because after you put in roads, you're not tearing them up, you're not doing anything like that. But if you take that consideration all the way to the very, very big first planning stages, like you can get a whole lot more, energy out of the same amount of homes, the same amount of infrastructure, the same amount of everything, because you're just pre-planning for, that type of thing.
Welcome back. Today we've got a fascinating guest who has spent his career studying the Texas grid in more detail than almost anyone outside of ERCOT itself. Dr. Joshua Rhodes is a research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a non-resident fellow at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy and the CTO and co-founder of IdeaSmiths. His firm has built some of the most detailed independent models of the ERCOT grid in existence, and he also hosts his own podcast on Texas energy and sits on the City of Austin's Electric Utility Commission. He has written more than 125 publications on energy systems, and is one of the few people who can tell you what the grid is actually doing, what the data says about where it is going, and what businesses should be doing about it. Josh, welcome to Renewable Rides.
Joshua, welcome to Renewable Rides. Super excited to have you. Really to dig in on all things Texas energy and the dynamic world that we're all living in. Before we get into some of those details, we always love to learn a little bit about the guests that are on the show. So both personally, professionally, what are you passionate about?
Yeah, I mean, really the things that really kind of make me tick are, I've always been interested in like efficiency, like, conservation, big outdoors guy. I love mountain biking, backpacking, hiking, like all of those kinds of things. But also, recognize like the world runs on energy. And so I want to try to get people the energy that they need to like, maximize their lives without kind of, messing up the reason that, some of the reasons that we're alive, to be out there and, be able to experience these things in the beauty. And so it's really like being able to hold both of those things at the same time. That's what, keeps me here at this computer for too many hours in the day.
Any good adventure stories from the bikes or the hikes?
My favorite things to do are probably like multi-day, backpacking like trips. Like you just get out like way far out there, further than anyone. I mean, it's like you go to any park or anything like that, and generally the first mile of the trail is going to be pretty packed with everyone with their speakers and all that other kind of stuff. You get further on down, and you can get further. I mean, I think some of the coolest places I've been is like backpacking into the Wamanuchi Wilderness, kind of in southwest Colorado, getting to some of those areas that you can just, where you're not just seeing the Milky Way, like, you can see all the stars in the Milky Way, but it looks more like a white sky with like a black dots in it. Like you can see so many stars. Like I really love getting out, to places like that where like, not that many people have, stepped foot.
That resonates so much with both of us. I know that's something that we all three of us share. Well, your background is super interesting from a education perspective, spanning mathematics, architecture, engineering. But like, where did this passion for energy and kind of all the thing that makes the world turn, where do you think that came from?
Yeah, I mean, it was really like it. So when I first like went to college, like I didn't actually know what I wanted to do. Like I had no real clue. Like maybe some people say they do, although I don't necessarily know that I believe them often. But like I did take the piece of advice that I've always like that I always tell people, which is like, okay, study the hardest thing that you like, right? If you're going to go into something, like study the hardest thing that you like, because the harder it is, the more doors it'll probably open. But you should still like what you're doing. Like, don't do something that you like don't study something or try to get into a field that you're going to hate because like you got to live, for the rest of your life, and that kind of thing. And so like the smaller school that I did my undergrad at, like the hardest thing there was math. And so I studied math. I was pretty good at math. And I didn't plan on like going to college for 12 years and getting a PhD, but like I just kept getting, this is wild, but I just kept getting out of school during economic recessions. All right. Like 2007, 2009, like all these things. And I figured out is like, hey, if you actually keep going to school, they don't make you pay your loans back. Right. And so it was just like, and I was pretty good at this school thing. And so I just kept going and applying and like I kept, getting in, and, eventually kind of made it over to, from mathematics into engineering. And I took this class, called thermodynamics when I got to the University of Texas. And essentially what it does is it kind of like puts everything in a systems view. It's like, it helps you understand like, okay, you've got inputs into a system and you get outputs out of a system. There's always losses, like, and it made all the math that like I do kind of that I had done, like it made it all make sense and kind of clicked. Like you can just understand how the world works. It was just a better representation of how the world works. And then, the professor who taught that, I ended up working for him and he was big on energy, and it just kind of guided me, towards that. And I just, was able to use all of the stuff that I had done to do something that I thought was cool. And, up until and it was kind of, not many people thought it was that cool up until like, not too long ago. And now everybody's really into energy and electricity for AI and data centers, all kinds of things like that. So it's, I don't know, somewhat fortuitous there.
Yeah. How crazy is it that it's the first time in our careers that energy is finally in the mainstream media, and here you are, you've timed it really well. Talk us through some of the highlights of that journey, some of the key pieces of work that you've been involved in or outcomes that you're proud of.
Yeah, so some of the, like my dissertation work was based a lot, like for the research side, it was based a lot of on the smart grid. This is like smart grid 1.0. So like some of the original, ideas of, we've got these networks, whether it's electricity, water, gas, or whatever, and it's a commodity and it flows one way. But like you can put an information layer on top of that, and you can be smarter about how it's, how that is produced and consumed and measured. And so we did I worked, some of the stuff I did was for a project in Austin called Pecan Street that wired a bunch of homes. Like there was it's thousands of homes now, but at that point it was a couple hundred. But we had these current transducers on like all the like input, like all the individual appliances. So like every 5 minutes, like how much energy is an EV charger consuming, and or a refrigerator or an air conditioner or all these other types of things. And you could really start to characterize, like, given an energy signal of a house, you could start to, tease out, different things about, different, about the way people consumed energy, because energy is not always the same price. So generally, like, consumers pay this like a flat rate for electricity, but in electricity markets, that price changes over time. And so we were able to kind of like figure out, and we had survey results about these homes. And so we knew like how many people live there, if they worked from home, like all these other kinds of things. And you could kind of start to figure out like, okay, given this demographic, this house is going to be more expensive to serve than this one. Like just given like when people are there and consuming energy and the price that it is, and these other kinds of things. And that was some of the like earliest work that kind of happened in kind of that kind of characterization. And then my favorite one that I did was taking some of the architecture stuff. I started looking at like entire subdivisions of homes, like, these more modern subdivisions of homes. A lot of them, they want to have solar and stuff installed on them. But the orientation and tilt of solar panels can really matter depending on, can really makes a difference on how much energy, they produce. The same solar panel facing the wrong way, might produce 40% of the energy if it's faced, the right way. And a lot of times after a house is built and all these other kinds of things, there's not much you can do. You're not going to change a roof, just for things like solar. But I started looking, okay, how far up in the process do we need to get to be able to maximize this? And I did some analysis where if you took an entire subdivision before you put down the roads, like the infrastructure, like everything, and sometimes if you could just rotate the whole thing like 5 or 10 degrees, like to make sure that the roads are going the right way, because the houses snap to the roads and then the roofs generally snap 90 degrees to like the front of the house, one way or the other. And like you could actually increase the local solar generation from an entire subdivision like 10 or 15% by sometimes just rotating the whole thing before you do anything, right? Because after you put in roads, you're not tearing them up, you're not doing anything like that. But if you take that consideration all the way to the very, very big first planning stages, like you can get a whole lot more energy out of the same amount of homes, the same amount of infrastructure, the same amount of everything, because you're just pre-planning for that type of thing. So that was my favorite one that I did.
That makes me think back to your comment around the thermodynamics and the whole systems thinking and pulling it all together. Have you seen any home developers listen and actually act on those insights?
No, I mean, not a bunch. I mean, some have found it interesting, and if anyone has, they haven't told me about it. But yeah, I don't. So I wish I could say in the affirmative, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, well, I think it's fascinating. Similar to you, I think about that stuff, and I feel very fortunate that the home that we bought has the largest portion of our roof is directly south facing. It could not be better.
Oh,
nice. Well, so before we get into some of your more specific research and the work that you're doing there within ERCOT, like what does success look like for you as you go on this journey?
I mean, I think like from the seat that I'm sitting in, it's really like I wear multiple different hats. But I think like what success looks like is actually generating work that stands the test of time, that actually makes change in kind of how things are done, whether that's like at the national or the state like legislature level. Like a lot of the work I do around the Texas legislature time goes to assess what the impacts of legislation would be, or like what these bills will do to the grid, or et cetera, things like that. And so, I mean, success to me is, being able to have that influence and using it for good.
It's great. You've done a lot of work, Joshua, around modeling the Texas grid, and you called the data center queue a bubble back in 2025. More than 220 gigawatts of requests, 70% from data centers. Yeah. Where is it at now? Where does it go from here? And what does that mean for all of us downstream of that?
Yeah, well, the bubble's just gotten bigger. I think the numbers, in the past a few weeks ago, the latest numbers put out were 435 gigawatts and 90% data centers.
That's crazy.
And so, I called it a bubble and I called it silly back then, but it's just gotten more bubbly and more silly. It's just like, there's just no way, like, for reference, like the whole ERCOT grid, like the maximum amount of energy that it's ever delivered at one time is 85.5 gigawatts. Wow. And so but the total amount of data centers that want to connect are like 410 gigawatts or 435 gigawatts. And they want to do that all in the next 5 years. And so you want to take it took 100 years to get to where we are today. And then in 5 years, we want to 5X it or something like that. Like, it's just, I mean, it's not going to happen. One, because like, even if they built that many big buildings and put all the computers in them, and you would have to bring everybody in the world who builds power plants would have to come to Texas and do nothing but build power plants in Texas. And I imagine other places in the world are also going to want power plants, that they're also going to want their data centers, like they're also going to want things. And so it's just like from like a full global supply chain, like you couldn't even pull that off. Right. And so it's just like, yeah, it's still a bubble, but I mean, like, even when bubbles burst, there's froth left over, right? And so, like, there's a lot of data centers that are getting built. I mean, I've driven by, I've seen them myself. There's a lot of data centers that are going to get built, and the grid's going to grow. It's just like, 2 years ago, my job, got a lot harder. My forecasting job, when I'm, estimating what, how much energy ERCOT's going to consume in 2030, 2040, 2050, got a whole lot harder when all of a sudden we went from like, just a, normal 2.5% growth, per year to 20, 30, 40, 50% growth per year. Like, it's still hard to tell how much of this is real.
Yeah. And have you got any thoughts on, traditionally Texas rates have been fairly competitive nationally.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to be severely impacted for consumers downstream of this froth?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. Is like, the higher utilization rate of infrastructure generally drives down costs, and so if we're consuming more like electricity over the same infrastructure, then like, that can drive the per unit cost down. However, what's happening right now is just like, because supply chains are not geared up to grow this quickly, like, these large loads are putting like strain on the existing system and the supply chain to expand that system. So, like, when I put on my electric utility commissioner hat, for Austin Energy, the local municipal utility in Austin, like, I see that, like, transformers, if you thought inflation on eggs was bad over the past, like, little while, like, inflation on on eggs is like maybe 10% or 15% or something like that. CPI, maybe 20, 30% exactly. But like transformers, it's like 200%.
Wow.
Like wires, it's like 180%. Like, switch gears to 2 to 3x, like, what they were a couple of years ago, because like everybody wants this infrastructure right now. And just with classic supply and demand, if everybody wants it now, that's going to drive the cost up for this stuff. And it's kind of like when you buy a house. Like, if you buy a house at the top of the market and then the market corrects, like, your lender doesn't give you a break on the principal like down the road, right? And so if we buy a bunch of infrastructure right now at premium prices and then like things cool down later, we're still going to be paying off the mortgage on that high priced, infrastructure. Mm. And so, like, I do think it's going to have an impact on rates. Now, Texas isn't the only place where like all this stuff is looking to grow, and everyone's paying buying this stuff off of the same markets. And so, I mean, I think it's going to put upward pressure on prices all around. But there's a lot of things geopolitically that's putting pressure on prices all around right now.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into that on the Iran and Strait of Hormuz front and get your impression on that. Just before you do, you mentioned Austin Energy.
Yeah.
In terms of all of this demand for energy and interconnection, how do we ensure that the utilities are just not like completely bogged down with analyzing who's actually legitimate or not? Like, what are you seeing there? How do you manage, like, where should they be putting their time and attention? Because not all of these projects can go ahead, as you've said. So how do we determine who is actually legit and where this infrastructure should go?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I really think the answer is to force more of these loads to put more skin in the game earlier on, right? Because like, so a lot of, we in Texas, like, we talk about this large load interconnection queue like we actually had a process in a queue. We didn't. Like, we've had a queue for generators for a long time. Like, if a wind farm or a gas plant wants to connect to the system, there's a very detailed, like, known process that you followed through. You did your studies, you got to this point. And then, once all the boxes were checked and your fees were paid, like, you were able to connect to the grid and do things. And we called that the generator interconnection queue. And then we just started calling this thing the large load interconnection queue. But there was no process, because like, we didn't have to have a process before it. Like, I talked to one transmission service provider in Texas a couple months ago, and they said, yeah, like 3 years ago they would have one large load study at a time, and so that's just manageable. Like you can do that, like you can just work that in the normal operations of the system. But at that time, they had 100 concurrent ones going on at the same time, and some of the data that ERCOT just put out showed that one of the biggest transmission service provider has like 280 of them going on like at the same time, like right now, and so like it just like it's just a different paradigm. So we're trying to like build this plane as it's already like, flying across the sky here in terms of like, how do you say who gets to connect and who doesn't? And how do we make sure that like, we're not, putting cost on the wrong people. And so what ERCOT's doing is they're actually doing this thing called a batch zero process, where they're going to study these things in batches, right? We used to be able to study them individually, but it's like once you study a large load here, like, and then, if another one pops up, on the other side, like it's already changed the grid dynamics that gave you the yes or no for like the first one, right? And so ERCOT's going to try to study a whole bunch of these at once, and they're also increasing the amount of money that you have to put down in order to do this, because one of the things around like particularly AI data centers right now is that they measure like the megawatt of compute not happening this year in like the billions of dollars. So if like if I've got a 1 megawatt data center that gets a year delay, like the losses are like in the billions of dollars, right? And these things are hundreds if thousands of megawatts, right? And so you're talking crazy amounts of like, crazy high valuation of, getting these data centers energized. And so a lot of times what we saw is these data center companies were putting the same project in 5 or 6 different places, like just trying to get somewhere quicker. And so that was inflating like the system, because again, we didn't have a process. And so it was very cheap to get in the quote unquote queue, but we're trying to change that now, and I think it is like, okay, if you're really serious, then yeah, put down some millions of dollars, some non-refundable millions of dollars. If you're, will go towards your cost if you're actually real. But if you're going to be, fly by night or just trying to flip a project, make it hurt if you are not real.
Yeah, that seems like the right approach, and we've heard that in other markets as well, that they're just ratcheting up the dollar values, and I think that's appropriate, because there is real cost in even doing these studies, and someone's got to pay for those costs at some point or another.
Right.
I do want to touch on one thing you've mentioned a couple times: supply and demand, and we've seen ERCOT, I'll use your term, is a bit of a petri dish in the energy world, and we've seen some pretty wild events where there's supply demand imbalances, and you said that or some of your forecasts were showing that demand was going to exceed supply here in this year in 2026. How's that playing out? And do you still think that's the case as we get into the summer months? And how's that going to impact ratepayers and particularly businesses?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we'll probably be okay. Like, this summer, just given like how many, of the data center, like just looking at like the conversion rate from paper study to actual energization, whatever, can't say it, of data centers, like it's not following like the hockey stick path that like a lot of them would like to, right? Because like it's just hard to build infrastructure. It's just slow. It's like the utility space is just historically like a slow space, and so I don't think we're going to see like some of these large numbers like come through here, and it's like the grid operator isn't like, they're not going to essentially allow, like, they're not going to connect so much load that they put the system at risk of doing this, right? It's like, and they know that, everyone knows that, and so it's like, it's kind of more or less just annoying that these numbers are just this large, kind of at this point. But I mean, one of the things that Texas does have going for us, particularly going into this summer, is like we have built so much solar in this state. And a lot of that's utility scale. There's a lot of distributed solar out there too. And the thing with solar that's just great about Texas is like, particularly right now, like the residential consumer is the swing consumer in Texas, right? And it's based on air conditioning in the afternoon. But it's the same sun that heats up a home that, makes an air conditioner run is making, electricity in solar panels. And in Texas, we also have a geographical advantage where the best solar resources are further west. And then as the sun moves from the east to the west, we generally have better alignment with peak demand and like solar production than in states like California, which are more north-south and narrower. We're tall, but we're also wide. And so like we can like gather we get a little bit, we get some help when it comes to that type of thing. And then in the evening time, we've already built out a whole bunch of wind, and that generally picks up well at night, even in the summer. The only real gap is kind of like a 6 to 9, 6 to 8, 7 to 9 kind of period where the sun's gone down before the wind picks up. But then we've also built like 20 gigawatts worth of energy storage like on the system. And so, but all of this is because the way that the Texas market works is that it incentivizes like the cheapest like form of energy, to show up, and it doesn't do it by mandates. It doesn't do it by picking winners and losers. It allows the market to work, and I think we're seeing the market work here. And so I think I think it is going to continue. I think it's going to continue to work. Because if you look at our interconnection queue, it's just chock full of more more solar and more storage.
Yeah, it's been interesting, hasn't it, seeing some people actually cancel their gas projects because the economics didn't seem to pencil or the supply chain risks made it too hard to execute. You said in 2025 that blocking renewables would cost Texans $15 billion over 15 years. Can you just build on that discussion then around, like, obviously solar and wind are driving so much value. What is the current state of play, and how do you think this is going to play forward?
Yeah, so I've done a fair bit of work on looking back historically, like trying to do a counterfactual, like what if we had never built any renewables in Texas? What would that mean? And it's like in the tens of billions of dollars, more in electricity cost that we would have paid, and not only in more cost but more emissions. We'd consume more water in the power sector, which water's a scarce thing in Texas. And so, one of the great things about, renewables, one of the great things about renewables is like you have a lot more like cost certainty when it comes to deploying them, because they're CapEx heavy, right? And so it's like when they're CapEx heavy, it's like you're going to spend the bulk of your money in the next couple of years, and then after that, like you're not going to have to, buy fuel and other types of things like that. And so, if you build a gas plant, like, you're going to spend a lot of money in the next couple of years, but then you're going to continue to spend money, for the next 30 years over the lifetime of that asset. And while you can hedge and lock in and, contracts for fuel costs and things like that, like you're never going to perfectly know what it's going to cost to make, energy with, that piece of equipment, in 20 years. And, we've seen, periods of time, like after, Russia and Ukraine in 2022, like natural gas prices tripled, and like a lot of places, like, that get a lot of their electricity from natural gas, like, electricity prices went up. Texas gets a lot of its electricity from natural gas as well, but we also have a lot of wind, we have a lot of solar, and it can act as a pretty good hedge against like that volatility, because Texas is a competitive market for electricity, and so the price of electricity is generally set by what we call the marginal generator. And so it's like the more cheap things you put kind of in that system, like the lower the cost of the marginal generator is, and that provides savings for everybody, no matter where you are in the state.
Yeah, you're starting to touch, and I know we wanted to hit on the more recent global conflicts and the Strait of Hormuz and how that's impacting things. I mean, and looking, it's almost 50% of the of the Texas grid is running on natural gas, and that's probably going to change as more,
Yeah.
to your point, the interconnection queue grows. But how do some of these conflicts? There's also a ton of oil and gas in the state of Texas,
Right.
but it's not an insulated market. It's a global commodities market.
Right.
How do these conflicts impact those generators and to your point, that variable fuel that needs to go into them to produce electricity?
Yeah, it's kind of weird, and sometimes it's kind of counterintuitive, like how the oil dynamics and the gas dynamics. Because, well, one, like the oil is a global commodity, right? And so it's like, as choke points like right now in the in the Middle East are restricting the amount of oil that can get onto the global markets, like that increases the price of oil basically everywhere. Natural gas is a bit different, right? It's like it's not as I don't want to use the term liquid because we're talking about oil and gases here, but like it's the global market is not as well connected for natural gas as it is for oil. And so while the price of oil is generally going to rise all over the world at the same time and go down all over the world at the same time, like the price of natural gas can be going up in one area and can be going down in a different area, but they are related, and particularly in Texas. Texas produces and consumes more oil and gas, than any other state, and we're like in the top 5 when it comes. If Texas were its own country, we're in the top 5 when it comes to oil and gas production. So I mean, we're just the energy state, period. Like, as obviously not just electricity and renewables are classic with your oil and gas, but there is an interesting dynamic when it comes to electricity and oil in Texas, because while we don't burn oil for electricity like we did in the 1970s, a lot of the natural gas that we produce in Texas is associated with oil production. So out in the Permian Basin, most of the time when they're out there drilling, they're actually drilling for oil, and gas is a byproduct. All right. And so, but we put the gas as much as we can into pipelines, and we consume it in electric power plants, or we liquefy it and send it around the world. But as the price of oil goes up, then more drillers start drilling for oil in the Permian Basin. And as more drillers drill for oil, they get more gas coming up with that oil. So a higher oil price can actually decrease the price of natural gas in the region, and that can actually lower the price of electricity because there's just more gas for the offtake. And at some point, that might be counterbalanced by LNG exports if the volumes get high enough to be able to tie the domestic price of natural gas to Europe's cost for natural gas, which can be 2 to 3 times, or Asia's cost, which can be multiples of what U.S. gas costs are. But sometimes things can move in different directions, and so a high oil price right now is actually putting downward pressure on the price of natural gas, which is putting downward pressure on the price of electricity.
That's super interesting. So just rounding out this conversation then, Joshua, you mentioned at the start of the podcast about your study around smart grids. We've obviously seen a lot more distributed behind the meter solar storage coming online. You're seeing that benefiting the grid to support these growth demands and providing more stability. And where do you see it heading in terms of what is the future of a more dynamic, prosumer-like grid?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely does. I think having resources kind of at the grid edge, can help with, not having to make as much, infrastructure upgrades, can obviously, save people on their energy costs, can be more resilient when it comes to, if you have something like solar and batteries and the grid goes down, you can still have some amount of energy there. So there's a lot of benefits to that happening. And in particular, things like distributed batteries, there can be quite a bit of benefit. And there's a lot of companies and utilities that are trying to get into kind of the more distributed battery game, because moving a bunch of little things around can, you add them up and it can look like you're moving like a big thing around, like a big battery. And so there's companies like, there's a company out of Austin called Base Power that's trying to do this. Like they're putting, batteries in at, residential and commercial, for a pretty low cost, and they're just using them in the ancillary service markets. They're using them in the market, but if the grid ever goes down, like you get the battery, for resilience. And so it's like, it's a pretty good play. And there's other utilities like Austin Energy, which I'm a commissioner at, that we've got a couple projects like that going on, trying to do these types of things. But one of the things that utilities and these companies are more so wanting to do is they're wanting to have more visibility and more control of those systems, because like I said, you can move a bunch of little things around, it can start to look like a big thing. Well, if you move a big thing too fast, like you can create impacts on the grid. And so, I mean, because like if you just have a few solar panels here and there and a few batteries here and there, it can kind of get lost in the noise of the system. But when you've got everybody's got solar and everyone has batteries and everyone, maybe there's electric vehicles in the mix and all these other types of things, like you can start to move the grid in ways that the grid is not wanting to be moved in certain times. And so I know a lot of that discussion is turning around, we've got these grid operators, but do we need these distributed, grid operators? Do we need to have more visibility further down into the grid edge? But that's a lot of data to flow. That's a lot of visibility. That's a lot of trust at the edge of these networks, which aren't always as strong as like the central and the core part of them. So I mean, there's a lot of technologies that can do a lot of these things. I know that a lot of utilities are also pretty scared more, of that, and moving slower than I and probably most people would like.
Well, so on that note, is that there's a lot of change happening? Are they resisting it, or not? I shouldn't even say resisting it, but is it slower moving because of just the resources to do so? Is it because the policy hasn't caught up and there's a need to update and change the policy to make those types of kind of more distributed level controls and planning effective? Like what is the rate limiting factor?
I mean, I think some of it comes to trust and some of it comes to policy. Like in Texas, we have this, in ERCOT, we have this ADER, Advanced Distributed Energy Resources kind of pilot going on. It's like a couple tens of megawatts. And it's kind of like trying to figure out, okay, like if you've got a bunch of distributed things and you make a call, you put a margin call on them, like what's your response rate? Like, how is, they want to figure out like, how much can I trust this? Because like they have high trust in, utility scale assets that they've been dealing with like for a long time. And it's just I think it's going to take some time to kind of, to build that trust. But I mean, I think there's different ways you could do it. I mean, I think you could just financialize the risk on that and just like, like you bid this in and you don't deliver, then, you're on the hook for, procuring that energy or that ancillary service or whatever it is, that you weren't able to, physically, deliver. And so, I mean, I think there's ways around it. It's just like, these are just things like that we haven't had to do. And it does seem like they're just a little bit scared of like the diffuse nature of this. Like the diffuse nature of these assets is actually a benefit when it comes to like interconnection, because like every home can take a battery, every home can take solar, right? It's like you don't have to do these massive interconnection studies or whatever, but it's also is like, then are you able to communicate back in like the timely manner that you want to? If we look at the successful pilots in our current ADR program, they're kind of these like the more kind of like, they're groups that own the entire stack. Like they've got like the technology, the communications, and like the relationship with a customer. So like there's, like I mentioned Base, there's also Tesla, there's Bandera Electric Co-op, there's a couple of these others, but they're kind of vertically integrated when it comes like to that whole thing. I think some others that have tried to do a bunch of like that have tried to stitch together a whole bunch of like composite things have just had a bit more trouble and haven't been able to, get that trust as fast.
Mm. Yeah, no, well, I was going to pull on that a little further, and curious, like, how much is that? Can it be price signal driven? So whether it's consumers or again us working more in the business landscape, like being able to give people real time price signals and or not even having humans in the loop, but there's some sort of algorithm that gets set to say if it reaches a certain price point, we're absolutely going to participate, or if it reaches a certain penalty, we're absolutely going to participate, and that can start to alleviate any sort of trust requirements because it's all financially driven.
Yeah, I mean, it's no, for sure. I mean, it's like, Texas has been a little bit burned on this, like kind of in the past. It was during Winter Storm Uri when the grid, blacked out and all these other kind of things. We had a retail electric provider that did a full pass through of wholesale, rates, and for the vast majority of time, like it saved a lot of people a lot of money, except for that 1 week where you went from 3 cents a kilowatt hour to $9 a kilowatt hour, and it just stayed there the entire week. Now, like hindsight's always 2020. There could have been some hedging products, some like collars and caps. There could have been a whole bunch of things that would have made that more palatable. I mean, I remember doing a quick back of the envelope analysis. It's like, yeah, even if you paid $9 a kilowatt hour for this 1 week, but if you were paying wholesale rates for the past like 4 years, like you still were on top, but you paid a lot of money right now, right? And like that's the hard part. That's the rub. I mean, I think it always comes as like, all right, if you're going to financialize it and take a risk and maybe have to get a hedging product on that, like, is there enough to make it worth it for the end, consumer there? I think that requires pretty dynamic markets, and Texas does have one of those, and other places do. But I mean, I think you've got to have access to those. You've got to have access to those, those financial markets on top of the electricity market.
Yeah. So for like businesses operating in the state, Joshua, commercial and industrial users of energy, do you see that they have the energy acumen to understand these dynamics and the risks and the opportunities? And like, what are the common misconceptions that you see through your work with IdeaSmiths?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the bigger, particularly a lot of like the transmission level service, like the large, industrial and consumers. I mean, they're pretty sophisticated when it comes to this type of thing. Some of them will have some of them will have their own trading desks. I mean, if you look at some of the large chemical manufacturing facilities like along the Gulf Coast, that are consuming gigawatts of power, meaningful percentages of ERCOT demand at any given time. It makes sense for them to be operating, as their own load serving entity, buying in the day ahead market, hedging, buying forwards, like all kinds of things, wrapping up PPAs, power purchase agreements and other types of things like that. So, I mean, there are sophisticated, actors, out there. Bringing it back to like the data centers though, it's kind of a weird spot right now, like for them, because they want power so fast and they want it yesterday and they want so much of it that their bargaining power is actually kind of low. Like when it comes to getting like the best deal or whatever. And maybe right now they don't care about the best deal because it's all about speed to power, but they're starting to care. They're going to have to eventually care about this. I mean, you're seeing all the big companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and all these others are going to instead of doing all you can eat for $20 like a month or whatever, they're starting to try to make you pay per usage of that kind of thing. So it feels like they're probably starting to get pressure on, how much they're paying, for power and compute and for generating tokens, and fake cat videos and all kinds of whatever, people are doing out there. It's, they're going to have to get to the point where they're going to have to be sophisticated, consumers of energy. But it feels like right now they're just like, I don't care, give it to me. I need it now. I need it yesterday.
It's very interesting though, isn't it? I saw a company post the other day that said, we've actually stopped using Anthropic and Claude because they've signed this deal with Elon's company and all that energy is gas generated. And we don't believe in compute being powered by gas. And so it'll be interesting to see, won't it, even from a user perspective, how that influences their strategy around what energy sources they want to use.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we're not paying the full cost of using these AI products yet. And which I don't know if we've ever paid the full cost of using anything on the internet. They just always seem to come out with something new to just keep the party going. But yeah, I mean, at some point you would think that you got to pay the piper. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so I'm curious before we jump into our power surge round. So, and we think about the executives out there that are not at an AI company, but the ones that are getting impacted by the decisions that are getting made around these large loads. Like if you had to have one development in energy over the next 5 years that a C-suite executive is not paying enough attention to, what would it be, and what would you share with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think really I think the biggest thing when we're talking about like all this new large load and all of this new growth and everything, like the hardest part. So I mean, there's roughly 3 parts of the system, right? There's where we generate electricity, we move it around, and then we consume it, right? And then sometimes that's really short, like if you're generating it right there where you're consuming it. But but even so, like the bulk of electricity consumed is still kind of on the bulk system. But building that middle piece, that transmission, is hard. Like it's really hard to do. But like if you want to get the power from where the people want to live to generally where where the cleanest power is produced, like a lot of that has to be a lot of we're going to have to build a lot of transmission kind of in this country. And so it's like if you're an executive and you want cleaner power, you want cheaper power, you're going to have to be a fan of transmission, even if it's not something that's immediately kind of in your purview. Like there's ways of supporting it through through consumer groups and other types of things like that kind of advocate for these types of things. But it's the hardest part of the piece to build, and it's the piece that we need to build the most of like right now. Because even if you're consuming a lot, generating a lot of energy, like on site, like I mean, sometimes you're generating more, you want to be able to, sell that, and not have to curtail that. And if it's, the conditions aren't great, like you want to be able to, around you want to be able to bring that in, because at the end of the day, we don't, at the end of the day, the world runs on energy, right? Everything we do runs on it. And so and if you care about it and you care about the environment, you're going to have to care about the grid.
Yeah, super fascinating. Joshua, this has been awesome. Love to close out with a few rapid fire questions. So if you could be any energy technology, what would it be and why?
I think it would be wind. I'd really love the feel of
Nice.
wind on my face, whether I'm out on a hike or I'm on a bike and pushing into it. Yeah.
Love that. You're very well read, written, and podcaster yourself. Where do you get content? Where do you stay up on the latest, whether it's books, podcasts, other resources?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a good section of kind of newsletters that I hit, from Bloomberg to Axios to Heat Map to Latitude and some others. I kind of distilled myself kind of down kind of in the morning. It used to be things like Energy Twitter, although that one's not as maybe not as good as it used to be. But yeah, those are my main mainstays of the day.
And a solid opportunity for a plug for your podcast, The Energy Capital.
That's right. Yeah, an Energy Capital podcast, where I'm going the other direction here.
That's right.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And can you close us out by finishing this sentence? In my life, I will have been successful when?
In my life, I will have been successful when I leave this world a better place than I found it.
Love that. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you for the research that you're doing. Thank you for helping drive policy and change. And I'm sure when you jumped into this world, over a decade ago and focused everything on energy, you didn't anticipate the craziness that would be happening here in the mid 2020s.
Absolutely not. I used to
Yeah,
have to explain to people what what ERCOT was, what electricity was. Like now I have to duck whenever I say what I do sometimes.
that's right. It's front and center for everybody now.
That's
No,
right.
this has been great. Appreciate you, and excited to get this out to our listeners.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Likewise.
Cheers. Dan, very interesting discussion, wasn't it? I think Texas is very unique, being in its isolated position, not connected to any of the other states or grids, and it kind of serves as a really interesting test bed, doesn't it, for what's possible and or the risks that come with it.
Yeah, I think I always love seeing what's going on. It's falls along with the spirit and the nature of Texas. It's we'll do it on our own type of mentality, and it does serve as a really interesting place for testing policies and approaches, and frankly one that from the kind of renewable naysayers I always point to say, look, like they don't care about whether it's sustainable or not. They care about whether it's cheap and delivers the power, and they're hands down the leader, both solar and wind. So I always love and appreciate learning from someone that knows that market far more than I do. Well,
Yeah.
what was your biggest takeaway?
Well, I thought the discussion around ramping up your oil production because the cost of oil due to supply chain constraints drives more drilling because you can make more money, but then gas being a byproduct of that, and then as a result the gas prices come down. I think that's definitely counterintuitive to many, isn't it? It's super fascinating, but I think it just continues to highlight to me, we need all forms of energy, but with renewables you have a lot more predictability from a price perspective, maybe from when it's available. It can still be challenged, but with batteries you replace that. With gas and commodities, you're still very dependent on a volatile, non-predictable, and global supply chain for the most part. And if gas prices are cheap, take advantage, but at some point you're going to get punished, and you have to be able to deal with those swings.
Well, and with 400 some odd gigawatts of load wanting to interconnect, the supply demand equation on that gas is going to be imbalanced.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? How about you?
The thing that I don't think I ever appreciated about Texas, and maybe that's because I'm here in California and we're the opposite, as he put it, California being north south, Texas being much more east west, and the population centers in Texas primarily being in the east, and the solar production primarily being in the west. It actually serves as an advantage. The most challenging time for any grid is the evening, the late afternoon and evening, when solar is starting to go away and the loads are ramping up, whether people are getting home or other activities. And so I don't think I ever appreciated that within their ERCOT grid that the solar is still going to be producing in the far west and delivering power to the east in the east's evening hours. And so, that was new information for me. I think beyond that, we closed out on a note where one of the biggest kind of flags, if you will, for business leaders is paying attention to the need for transmission. And I like how he put the three parts. There's generation, then moving of the electrons, and then the consumption of them, and the area to focus being that transmission piece. However, I think if you are producing more local energy, more on-site energy, yes, there's going to need to be upgrades in the distribution grid, because especially as there's bidirectional consumption and production and flows of electricity to your neighboring areas, I don't see as big of a need for the large scale transmission. Now, again, if we're fulfilling and building a centralized system, yeah, that's the case. But if we're building a more distributed system, then it's not going to be as much of a case. And to his point, it's very challenging to build. There's the whole NIMBYism. Nobody wants big power lines in their backyards, and it also requires mega scale transformers, which, as he said, is experienced this meteoric rise in inflation on those products. So I hope that we don't have to pay as much attention to the transmission system as Joshua states.
Yeah, I was on a panel discussion at a JLL data center forum just the week before last, and one of the questions asked was, 5 years from now, looking back, what will we be kicking ourselves about? What were we naive about? And I think we're now seeing something like 30% of all data centers resorting to behind the meter systems. And for the most part, what I took away from the conference is most of that's gas. They're not really considering solar and wind at scale. And my comment was, they are all positioning that as being bridge power and waiting for the utility to show up with power. And I said, I think the naive piece is expecting that to play out, because I think these linear transmission lines are very, very hard to build, very hard to design, very hard to get permitted. And you're looking at probably 10 years in the making, unless something from a regulatory perspective massively changes. And so then, are you always reliant on that, and you just have to build your data center around what you were able to self-generate? And as such, have you oversized your data center and you can't power it? Or do you end up with all of this power infrastructure behind the scenes and the utility does show up, and now you've got a stranded asset that's having to compete in the wholesale market? I think it just creates a really interesting dynamic that I don't think anyone is thinking about. I think it's just, like you said, that knee-jerk reaction, get the power out there, don't think too much about it, and deal with it later. But I think there could be some significant consequences down the road.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, if I'm a business leader, I don't necessarily want to pay for all of that. I want to produce and consume and take matters in my own hands. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. ERCOT in Texas might be different than elsewhere, but it's a fascinating place to watch.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's too much different, is it? We just saw that article about Tahoe and the community now being told maybe they won't have power because it needs to be redirected to a data center. And I think that's probably the canary in the coal mine for many business leaders. They need to be aware that there's going to be downstream impacts of this, and there's not enough power to go around. And so you need to start thinking about how you control your own destiny.
Certainly. I think we may need to do an episode on just that topic, because there's a lot to unpack there. So this was a great one. Gareth, thanks for the time.
Cheers, Tom.
Cheers.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.